My name is Amanda Vaughn. I currently teach English Language Arts in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. But for the purpose of this assignment and activity, I am working specifically with my 8th grade students. I will be doing a close reading on an excerpt from Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. It relates to The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. I'm choosing to do this on the perspective of a literary analysis with an emphasis on argument writing. This material is very challenging to read for students and very challenging to understand even for the most proficient readers. The text itself is worded in a way that it makes it difficult to understand for students. It also makes it very complicated to teach because you do have to break it down into very simplistic terms for the students to be able to understand it. Since I do work with a group of struggling readers, it has made it a greater challenge, and we're having to move extremely slowly through the materials. We're actually only reading about 4 to 5 paragraphs each day and spending a significant amount of time on breaking down those paragraphs. My students are currently reading The Hobbit in their 8th grade reading class, so I'm going to be focusing on teaching citing evidence for the purpose of argument-based writing, using both The Hobbit and On Fairy Stories in addition to other informational text. Students have previously been taught all of the elements and components of science fiction, fantasy, fairy tales, and other genres of literature. But we're going to hit a really heavy emphasis on those 3 in particular. Hopefully by the end of this unit, my students will be able to argue whether or not The Hobbit is a fairy tale or is not classified a fairy tale based on the components that make up this story. They're going to be conducting some independent research in addition to what I provide for them and their reading teacher provides for them. Their arguments are going to have to be based on specific evidence and supported with materials from the text. So this is just a small excerpt of what we've been doing. This is what it looks like that we worked with in class today. So there is a lot of highlighting, a lot of sticky notes, a lot of notes in the margins. And I'll just take a minute and read through this very quickly, stopping at the points that we addressed in class today, so you can see kind of how our close reading went with this assignment. Now, though I have only touched wholly inadequately on elves and fairies, I must turn back, for I digressed from my proper theme, fairy stories. I said the sense of stories about fairies was too narrow. This kind of led me to believe that he thinks that fairy tales themselves have to have fairies in them, and if a story does not have fairies, then it cannot be classified as a fairy tale. But as I continue to read, I feel like this is more of just his way of leading into the topic, that it's not necessarily based on whether or not there are fairies included in the stories to be classified as a fairy tale. It is too narrow, even if we reject the diminutive size. Diminutive, that was a word that kind of tripped me up a little bit when I was reading, so I did have to go in and look it up. And I thought maybe in the context of what I was reading, it had to have been referring to small size, because when I think of fairies, I think of things like Tinkerbell, who is very small and flies around. For fairy stories are not in normal English usage stories about fairies or elves, but stories about fairy, that is, fairy, the realm or state in which fairies have their being. So this kind of confused me because there's 2 different spellings here. We have fairy, F-A-I-R-Y, which is the little fairy like Tinkerbell, and then we have F-A-E-R-I-E. But it says this could be the realm or state in which fairies have their being. So I'm thinking it's probably not a place, it's more of a state of mind or a place of existence rather than a specific location. Fairy contains many things besides elves and fairies, and besides dwarves, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. So that's kind of a lot of information to take in. But if I break it down into just small pieces, I guess it's saying that there are things like dwarves and witches and trolls and giants and dragons, which are all kind of mythical creatures, but it also holds the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth. So is it a system or a solar system or an alternate universe maybe? And all the things and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. Enchanted kind of throws me off a little bit. Is it saying when we ourselves as mortal men are in an alternate state of mind? So that kind of makes me wonder if it has to be something that I have to believe in, or is it something that actually does exist? Overall, I think what I'm getting from this particular paragraph is that fairy tales can contain all of these things, but they don't necessarily have to. So I'm going to continue reading on into the second paragraph. Stories that are actually concerned primarily with fairies, that is, with creatures that might also in modern English be called elves, are relatively rare. So that leads me to believe that maybe fairies and elves do not have to be in fairy tales. And as a rule, not very interesting. Okay, well, I'd have to disagree with that because Tinkerbell's kind of interesting to me, and she's cute. Most good fairy stories are about the adventures of men in the perilous realm or upon its shadowy marches. Well, I know that a perilous realm is something that's full of danger, and it's kind of like an adventure. So if I think back about what I'm reading in The Hobbit up to this point, they are on an adventure, they're on a quest. That's kind of the purpose of the story. So could it be that this is a fairy tale based on the fact that they are on a quest, and aside from that, that there are actually elves in The Hobbit? Naturally so, for if elves are true and really exist independently of our tales about them, then this is also certainly true. Elves are not primarily concerned with us, nor we with them. So we're not really worried about the elves, and the elves aren't really worried about us being the mortal beings. Our fates are sundered, and our paths seldom meet. Sundered is definitely not a word that I use very often, so that's one that I'm going to go back and look up and bring it back into the context of the story. Even upon the borders of fairy, we encounter them only at some chance crossing of ways. Again, the way fairy is spelled, F-A-E-R-I-E, it leads me to believe it's a place, but based on what I read in the paragraph above it, I can't be sure that it is actually a place. The definition of a fairy story, what it is or what it should be, does not then depend on any definition or historical account of elf or fairy, but upon the nature of fairy, the perilous realm itself, and the air that blows in that country. Okay, now I'm confused again. I don't know if it's a place or a state of being or a state of mind. So a lot of this information seems kind of contradictory. I will not attempt to define that nor to describe it directly. It cannot be done. Fairy cannot be caught in a net of words, for it is one of the qualities to be indescribable, though not imperceptible. Another word that's confusing. It has many ingredients, but analysis will not necessarily discover the secret of the whole. So even if I break it down, is it telling me that I'm not going to be able to understand what fairy is? Yet I hope that what I have to say later about the other questions will give some glimpse of my own imperfect vision of it. For the moment I will say only this: a fairy story is one which touches on or uses fairy, whatever its own may purpose may be. Again, I'm going to have to get back to what fairy is, because I need to have a really clear understanding of that, so I think we'll go back in just a minute and reread through that section. Satire, adventure, morality, and fantasy. Okay, so that gives me a little bit of an idea of what the purpose of the story is, what I'm going to read. So is it going to be funny? Is it about adventure? Is it about morality, life and death, or is it fantasy? Fairy itself may perhaps most nearly be translated by magic. Okay, so we do have some magic in there, but it is magic of a peculiar mood and power, at the furthest pole from the vulgar devices of the laborious scientific magician. There is one proviso. If there is any satire present in the tale, one thing must not be made fun of, the magic itself. That must in the story be taken seriously, neither laughed at nor explained away, or the seriousness of this seriousness the medieval Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is an admirable example. So what I think I'm understanding for this is Gandalf is a wizard. If Gandalf is a wizard, then he practices magic. If he practices magic and there's any satire or humor in the story of The Hobbit, we can't make fun of Gandalf and we cannot make fun of his magic, because if we do, then it doesn't fall under the description of a fairy tale. So now when I go back through and reread this, I'm going to look for specific examples that I can relate to the text of The Hobbit and see if I can align any of the character descriptions, any of the experiences, any of the adventures that have taken place with just these few 3-4 paragraphs that I've just finished reading. Then I'm going to go back through again, and I'm going to go and find all the definitions of those words that I don't know and replace those words in this article or in this essay with words that I do know or that I'm more familiar with. So this is going to take some work to get through, but we are going to continue to go through it very slowly. We're going to continue to work through it together, and hopefully we can continue to make those connections between reading of The Hobbit and reading of On Fairy Stories to see if we can come up with an argument as to whether or not this can be identified as a fairy story or fairy tale, or if it does in fact belong to a realm of science fiction or fantasy.